Welcome back to BreakBeatCode. We are super excited to have our next guest join us, Aaron Wade. Aaron is a creative technologist at Google's Creative Lab, where he prototypes next generation user experiences using generative AI technologies. He graduated from Yale University with bachelor's degrees in computer science and psychology, and he also has a background in linguistics and music. And he brings all these things together in one of his most recent projects called TextFX. So what's TextFX? TextFX is an AI experiment and a collaboration between Google and Grammy Award-winning rapper Lupe Fiasco, which uses large language models to generate creative possibilities using text and language. And outside of work, Aaron is a composer and a multi-instrumentalist who also loves learning languages. So please welcome Aaron Wade.
So, Aaron, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit about you, who you are, and what you do at Google.
Yeah, so my job title at Google is Creative Technologist, which doesn't really mean anything to most people. So I guess I'll start by just speaking a little bit more to just what I do. So I sort of have background that spans across lots of different disciplines, ranging from computer science, psychology, linguistics, music, and a lot of my sort of professional trajectory has been marked by like sort of composing these things in different configurations in order to build things. Sometimes they're products, sometimes it's some sort of other artifact, but build things that sort of connect people with each other, connect them with the world, and at Google, connect them with what Google has to offer. Yeah, I mean, I double majored in computer science and psychology. I did my undergrad at Yale, and my first intro to Google was I interned at Google as a software engineer. And did the sort of standard software engineer intern things, I guess. And while I was there, I sort of got connected to this little org at Google that I work at now called the Creative Lab, just through a sort of a mutual connection, and sort of capitalized on that and sent an email to the lab using my Google alias at the time, and was like, hey, my name's Aaron. I am creative and I do tech. I would love to learn more about what you guys do. And then I guess the rest is sort of history. When I was back on the East Coast, I met up with this guy, Robert, who just happened to be the VP of the Creative Lab, and had breakfast with him. Vibes were good. He sort of connected me with, a whole bunch of other faces on the team. And I just had a series of conversations, which in hindsight were interviews, of course. But it didn't feel like that. And so that was a day. And then the sort of vibe out of that was, oh, we'd love to have you back and learn a little bit more about you. So I came back maybe a month later, and did another sort of, I guess, round of interviews that didn't really feel like interviews. And then after that, I think the notion was kind of like, oh, we'd love to continue the conversation, something nebulous like that. And I was like, okay, I don't know what that means, but I need to let this recruiter know if I'm going back as a sweet intern. So I would love if you could let me know if we can make something work. So I basically just kept bothering them until they got back to me. And they finally did. They're like, hey, we think we can bring you in, next summer as a sort of short-term collaborator, and sort of let you try out the whole creative technologist thing. And a creative technologist at the Creative Lab is just somebody whose sort of medium of making is tech and coding, but there really isn't a set list of job responsibilities outside of that. So, I mean, a lot of what I do is nowadays I work with generative AI technologies. When I started at the Creative Lab, that wasn't really a thing, but it was, again, just more sort of trying to find creative ways to marry the tech, what Google has to offer technically, or from a technical standpoint, with the needs of the world and the needs of our users. And so I sort of came into the Creative Lab as I wasn't called an intern, but it was kind of like an internship that was originally supposed to be, a few months over the summer because I was still in college at this point. And this, mind you, this was during COVID. So I did that. I think maybe a month and a half into that, I had like sparked a new project that was getting a little bit of traction at the lab. And so they were like, hey, you know, you're kind of leading the charge on this thing. We'd love if you could actually stay through the end of the year. And at that time, as I said, it was COVID. So I didn't really have anything better to do. Like if I was going to go back to school, I would have just been online school. So I was like, oh, easiest decision, no brainer. I'll take a semester off from school and stay at Google, stay at the Creative Lab for a little bit more. And then they did the same thing again and extended me through, you know, the end of the following summer, which I did. But I was like, hey, I kind of need to finish school. So I did a thing where I was working at Google part-time for a semester, but also in school full-time that semester. So it was very sort of a balancing act there. And then I took some time off from the lab to sort of finish my thesis and graduate. And then I came back to the lab at the beginning of last year, sort of still as a freelance collaborator. And then just very recently, I converted to a full-time in-house Google employee. So that's sort of been my very non-linear trajectory into Google. And as I said, now we have sort of found ourselves immersed in this landscape of generative AI technologies. So a lot of my work revolves around, you know, identifying users and populations who really stand to benefit from the sort of technology that we have, and finding ways to sort of empower and supercharge workflows through product design and product innovation. Because I think, you know, something that I've noticed during my time at Google is that sometimes the people who are designing these products and these technologies and these systems aren't necessarily the best people to use them, because, you know, they're not necessarily tapped into the needs of the users who might stand to benefit from those technologies. So that's sort of my job, is to figure out where is the there, and sort of work with users and work with communities to co-create solutions. AI solutions.
That's awesome. By the way, I love your energy. It's tough to like not smile when you talk.
Oh, thank you.
So can you tell me a little bit more about the project you worked on with Lupe Fiasco? Like, I'd love to, yeah. We're going to talk about it during the event itself, but I'd love to hear a little bit more of the background.
Yes. So earlier this year, I had the awesome opportunity to tech lead a project that is called TextFX that we made in collaboration with Lupe Fiasco, who is a Grammy Award-winning rapper and lyricist. And TextFX is basically a platform that leverages large language models to help writers explore creative possibilities with text and with language. And so this collaboration came about, honestly, very randomly. I think there was somebody in the Creative Lab who had like a random roundabout connection with Lupe, because Lupe is a professor at MIT, and somebody who used to work here had a connection at MIT and was like, oh, I think we could get Lupe Fiasco to like collaborate on something cool in this space. And I think that something that really set this project apart from, I guess, collaborations of a similar nature is that we really wanted to focus on building something from the ground up with this collaborator, rather than like having an idea in our heads and then pulling in somebody famous to sort of like drive the point home, right? Like that wasn't what the spirit of this collaboration was. So a lot of what the project was at the beginning was us just sitting in a room in Cambridge with Lupe and just literally having him like show us his process. So it was just us in a room with Lupe, and we would maybe come into the meeting with like, you know, a few questions or just a few like provocations of like, what gets you going? What inspires you? What does a writing session look like for you? What unique problems do you face? What victories do you celebrate the most in your process, right? And sort of trying to, it's interesting when you work with somebody, especially at Lupe's caliber, or somebody who's operating at as high of a level as Lupe is, because you're seeing this expert in this field talk about his craft in a way that almost takes for granted that like none of us are rappers, none of us are, you know what I mean? And I think part of the reason why I was tapped to lead this project is because despite, you know, being a technologist and a developer, I also have a really sort of strong sensibility to words and to language. And so a lot of my sort of shaping this project in the beginning was like sort of being a springboard with Lupe and being like, oh, like you said this one thing about this like word, or like, can you like, let's double click on this like linguistic concept that you brought up, or like, you know, how does this thing that you were thinking about earlier in the conversation, like I saw that this came back up in a way that none of us were anticipating. Like, how did you get from point A to point B to point Z, right? So I think that, you know, as I mentioned, when people hear the term creative technologist, like they don't really know what to make of that. I think that, you know, what I found is the biggest difference from like between being a creative technologist and being a software engineer, which was sort of my foray into Google, is that, you know, as a software engineer, you're sometimes developing solutions to problems that have been identified, or sometimes you're just implementing those solutions. But as a creative technologist, you're sort of identifying the problems, you're identifying the things that need solving. And you're identifying like the what, but also, and perhaps more importantly, the why. Like why is the Creative Lab uniquely suited to solve this problem? Why is Google uniquely suited to solve this problem? Like what about our technology makes us like the best people to speak to this problem, right? And so that was completely the early stages of this project, was just sort of trying to shape like the rationale, like shape the like why behind the what. Like we knew that we had this awesome idea for a collaboration. We knew that we had this awesome collaborator, but like sort of my job was to come in and connect all the dots, like on a conceptual level, and then like sort of deliver on a technical level, right? And sort of also being an expert in like all the tech along the way. So I remember in one of our earliest sort of in-person meetings with Lupe, I just gave like a 20-minute like intro presentation of like, what the hell is a large language model? Like how do they work? Like why, like, you know, why is this relevant to you? I think something also that one of my guiding sort of principles in the work that I do is like, you can have all of the cool tech in the world and all of the sort of technical capabilities into the world, but if you're not able to convince your users as to why that is meaningful to them, then you're always going to fall short. So I think that, you know, one of the points that I always try to drive home, and no matter what kind of project I'm working on, is like, how are we showing users that this thing is meaningful to them? And so, yeah, so we did that. There's a lot of back and forth. There's a very iterative process. And what we sort of noticed is that Lupe has a really unique way of sort of ingesting all of this sort of linguistic data in his process of creating raps. Like I think a lot of people just like take for granted all the complexity that goes into rap. Like a lot of people, we hear the final result of like, oh, this is like a sick verse that rhymes and like has all these cool entendres and blah, blah, blah. But like, if you were to take Lupe's brain and like represent that, like this man was literally moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And so the provocation that came of that was like, how can we use large language models to sort of like empower that process? And what we started to do is sort of take some of these things that Lupe would show us. So I think one of the sort of most illustrative examples of this is Lupe had this really unique way of taking a word and like sort of doing all of these different phonetic reimaginings of a word. So he would take a word like expressway and like turn it into like express way, like express space WHEY. And he would say like expressway is like a speedy delivery of dairy byproduct, right? Or he would say, yeah, exactly. Or he would say like expressway is like expressway, like X-press space way, like a path that excludes like news media, right? So like that was the first example we had where I was like, oh, like Lupe is taking this linguistic data point and like performing what is actually a very concrete process or operation over this like item, right? Mm-hmm. And so what we had him do as an initial experiment was sort of like give us a whole bunch of examples of that task that I just sort of demonstrated to you. And then we took that and sent it to an LLM. Like one of the great things about an LLM is that they're really good at recognizing patterns in data, and they're really good at replicating tasks after you just give them a few examples of that task. So what we did is we sort of sent those examples that Lupe gave us of this task and sent them to the large language model, and to see if it could do it with any degree of precision, you know. And so I think one of the first things that we sent was, oh yeah, we sent the word recognize, and what the LLM gave us was recognize, like to fix a broken clock, like to fix the broken cogs in a clock. And I remember the moment that we showed Lupe that, he was like, whoa, like that's, the words he said was, that's fire.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and like I think to like the average, like to an average person, it's like maybe cool, right? But I think to us being in the room with Lupe, who like lit up more than he ever had, like at any point prior to this, that was when we knew, like, oh, like we need to double click on this, right? And so what we did is we just tried to sit and like figure out if there were other sort of subtasks or like atomic processes that went into his lyric writing workflow that we might also be able to extract in a similar way. And we tested a lot more ideas than ended up in the final product. But what we ended up with was this sort of 10 sort of discrete sort of linguistic functions that each take in as input a word or a phrase or a concept, and spit out as output some sort of phonetic or semantic or conceptual reimagining of that input, right? And then we built a cute, I mean, this is all powered by a large language model, by Google's Palm 2 large language model. And then we built basically a nice front end to house it. A lot of how I think about this kind of work is like purpose-driven abstraction on top of an LLM, which is actually a phrase that I got from somebody that I met at a conference, so I can't claim full ownership of that. But
good one now.
Yeah, but even the idea behind the name TextFX, right, is that like, so if you think about like effects, like FX, like, you know, musicians have sound effects that they can use, like visual artists have, you know, brush packs and shaders and all sorts of digital tools that they can use to enhance and empower their workflow. But when it comes to people whose medium of creation is language and text, up until this point, all they had was maybe a rhyming dictionary or a thesaurus. And to us, that didn't really make sense when we're swimming in this landscape, in this sea of generative language technologies, right? So the idea behind the name TextFX is that each of these tools that we've created sort of operates on text and language in a way that is analogous to how a sound effect, for example, might transform a sound.
I have a few more questions about that, because what you described with Lupe's process, it's kind of uncanny how much it seems to be similar to the way an LLM works in many ways, right? Because it kind of breaks down a word into different tokens.
Yeah.
So could you give us like kind of in degrees? I'm not sure if you've ever seen this, where they say like kindergarten version. Yeah. Could you give us like what would be like the middle school version of describing an LLM?
So if I had to describe an LLM to a middle schooler, I would say one way to think, okay, so the sort of most like fundamental way to think of a large language model is as a giant string supercomputer. And the way that an LLM is trained is that we basically send it sequences of what we call tokens, which you can sort of think of as words. It's a little bit more complicated than that under the hood, but we send them sequences of tokens, and basically an LLM learns the relationships between items in this sequence. So the way that an LLM generates text actually is it's constantly predicting the next token given, you know, all of the previous tokens that it's seen. That's like the sort of core, in grossly oversimplified terms, that is like sort of the core functionality of an LLM, is that it is predicting how a text continues. So when you send an LLM a prompt, for instance, like you might, let's say you're chatting with Bard and you send Bard like a string, like, oh, you know, can you do XYZ thing for me? Like Bard is not so much answering your question as it is like predicting how that string might continue. If that that's like the headspace that I sort of think in when I'm thinking about LLMs. That is to say, it's all a very probabilistic science. It's all like predictive, right? And if you want to go into a little bit more detail, an LLM sort of consists of two components. One is an encoder, one is a decoder. And what is happening is that when you send an LLM a text, that text is actually getting converted into what we call vectors, which is basically getting converted into some sort of numerical representation. Because a large language model is just a huge probabilistic model that's doing a lot of math, a lot of linear algebra sort of stuff under the hood. So at the end of the day, it's all numbers. It's text that we see that gets converted into numbers. That is what the model is processing. And then there's a decoding step where those numbers get converted back into text, which is what we see. So that's basically what an LLM is.
Got it. So maybe could we use the specific example you had before, like recognize? So could you help us like understand like what is an LLM doing when it's in, you said like it's encoding recognize, like could you like walk through that?
So I mean, what LLM is doing when it's encoding is it's just basically taking, let's say that we just send it that one thing. It's taking that token and it's converting it into a a vector, which is basically a collection of numbers, like a super, super, super long vector that's getting projected into a vector space. And then it's basically performing some operations on that vector and then spitting out a result. But I think a more apt explanation of what's going on with the recognize task is a little bit higher level of abstraction. So like I said, we're sending this LLM examples, right? And I told you an LLM is like just a giant string predictor. So what the LLM is seeing is that, let's say that we sent it expressway and like all of these different ways to phonetically re-render expressway. So we send it expressway in these phonetic re-renderings. And then in the same sort of input string, now at the bottom, we put recognize, right? And that's what we send to the model. Now the model's like, oh, like express all of these outputs of expressway are to expressway as X is to recognize. So it's like sort of like it's using that example that you sent as training is like, we have to use that word carefully, machine learning, but like we call it like a training example, right? Because if you think about what an LLM is doing, like LLMs sort of change the whole landscape of machine learning, because if we were trying to train if we were trying to train a model to do this like word explosion task using traditional machine learning, what we would have to do is curate a data set of hundreds to thousands of examples and just train a model on that, right? But how LLMs change the game is that now you can do that same thing with a handful of examples, or maybe with no examples and just a really detailed explanation of what you want it to do. So what we see with LLMs is that it's a more task agnostic representation of language inside the model. And what that allows for is like this hyper versatility in how you're able to use the model.
Got it. So if I could come up with like almost an analogy, it's sort of like in the old way of doing things, you'd almost have to get Lupe to say like, okay, this is what I just did with the word expressway. The way I broke it down is X dash press. And like, this is how I did it with 10,000 more words.
Yes.
And now I'll come back to me with the results. And this time you just said, he did this with expressway. You kind of get the gist. Now do it with recognize.
Exactly. And that was even using an older model, right? Like nowadays you could probably even just like tell the model, like without even giving an example, you could just tell the model what you want it to do. And it can do it. That's called instruction tuning. When I started back in the early days of Google, when I started working with LLMs, like you couldn't even tell an LLM what you wanted. Like the only way to get an LLM to generate the output that you wanted was to just like frame your prompt as like an incomplete document.
Right.
And you really just had to the frame of mind you had to be in was like, if I want the LLM to generate what I want, how do I give it like context around what I want and like have it complete that context? Nowadays it's easy. Now you can just be like, I want this thing, and like the LLM spits it out for you. Right. But for me, it's been helpful to always sort of like look back to like, this is actually what's going on under the hood, because I think sometimes it helps you surface really innovative ways to conceptualize or represent a problem, right?
Right.
So.
Wow, I've actually already learned a ton. This is really cool. I could talk to you all day. So many questions. So So let's talk a little bit more like about you and kind of your creative process, because like you didn't talk as much because you're an engineer, you're also an artist, so you compose music. You're going to Juilliard if I recall
Yeah, I'm
correctly,
taking a
right?
class at Juilliard, yeah, in the evenings.
Right. Right. And like you casually have like a collection of like 15 violins and cellos and like it's all a bunch of different stringed instruments. So like when you think, because like one thing that's really interesting the way you described your experience with Lupe and how you engaged with Lupe in his work and like the whole process is that it was a process for one thing. Like it was very intentional. It was step one, two, three. Because sometimes I think people think of artists as just being like moment inspiration, song comes out. And like while that does happen, right?
Yeah.
There are some people that have like a fully realized song.
Yeah.
Like there is a process to it. So like what about like your creative process both as an artist and as an engineer?
Yeah, I mean, so I think my creative process as an artist, like, so I will, before I answer, I will say that I think there was an element of like genius and like this like sort of unpinnable sort of just like creative inspiration that isn't captured in like the process, like what we came up with, right? Like, and I think that is almost a good thing because it's like goes to show that like an LLM can't like it's not stealing from Lupe Fiasco, right? It's just like it's just sort of helping concretize like the parts of his process that can be concretized. The reason I bring that up is because I think that there's also an element of my creative process that is just like, oh, like this thing just pops into my head. Like, what are the tools that I have available to me to realize that idea, right? You know what I mean? So it's like some like as a musician, sometimes I will just wake up in the middle of the night and hear an orchestral piece in my head. But it's not always the case that I have the time or the means to sit down and write out, like orchestrate this entire piece. So like, for instance, like something I think about a lot, and I could actually talk about this for a day. I wrote college essays about this like concept of abstraction and like how can you like represent an idea in like the highest fidelity possible, but also balancing like lowest sort of effort or cost, right? So like my first instrument, I'm self-taught, but like my first instrument is the piano, right? So whenever I have a musical idea that I need to like represent for myself, whether it be for safekeeping or whether it be so that I can just sort of keep it spinning in my mind while I go work on other things, like one of the first things I'll do is sit down at the piano and just like and tinker in that way. And it's like, even if, like I said, even if the thing that is in my head or the thing that I'm writing is not, it's not a piano piece, it's not pianistic. Like what the piano helps me do is sort of just like get that idea, get that idea into a space where I can start giving it momentum, right? I think my process as an engineer, as a technologist is the same. Like I can have an idea about anything, right? And for me, it just so happens that, at least in professional context, like my way of communicating ideas, of sharing ideas, of showing ideas is through tech. So, I mean, at the Creative Lab, especially, there's a huge culture of prototyping, right? That's sort of the language of the lab. So, if I have an idea that I need to communicate, it's like now I've sort of developed this skill of like being able to sit down and find a way to like encapsulate that idea using code, whether it be, a really quick and scrappy web prototype. Maybe sometimes it's just like a Jupyter notebook or a Colab notebook, if you know what those are.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not even code. Maybe it's just like sort of like a UX, like a hypothesized UX flow. Maybe it's an LLM prompt, right? That's sort of something that I want to do. And I think that my creative process is like just as much about the output as it is like discovering new kinds of tools that I can add to my toolkit for communicating my ideas. So I think that like one of the things that I love most about my job is that like there's almost unlimited affordances for like learning for the sake of like activating and showing my ideas to people, right? So it's like I can sit down and like spend a day like learning, I don't know, some front end framework that I don't know. If I think that it's going to help me communicate my ideas better, like it's an easy sell to my boss. Like, oh, I can't work today. I can't do XYZ meeting today because I need like a day to just like really dig into this and make myself a better creative technologist, right? So I think that like, I mean, I guess it's all sort of meta if you think about it too hard, but I feel like in every possible sense, like my job feels very generative. Like learn the things so you can make new things, and make the things so you can learn new things. And don't let I think that it's easy to let this like apprehension of like, oh, well, people like this, or this fear of like, will it look good enough? Will it feel good enough? I think it's easy to let those things get in the way of just like getting something on paper. And I think it's a little bit of a skill to just like, or a little bit of an exercise rather, to train yourself to like release all of those notions of like, that sort of fetter you, and just get it out there.
You talked about your experience getting into Google, and I'd love to talk a little bit about rejection, because like the way you describe it, it reminds me like rejection kind of comes in two forms. There's sort of like the no, and then the sort of just continuation. They respond to you, they don't commit to doing anything necessarily. It's sort of like, yeah, good to talk to you, we'll keep in touch type thing. And so you clearly like learned a way to kind of deal with that. You talked about bugging them. I'm sure you weren't actually bugging them, but you're persistent, but you did that in like a nice way. So like, how'd you do that? How'd you deal with like kind of the passive rejection, in the sense they weren't just saying, yes, come in and like, we'll give you a job. Like, how'd you deal with that? And how do you like kind of keep your motivation to keep going?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of my sort of immediate reflexes to any form of rejection, whether it be this more sort of slow burn, like limbo sort of rejection, or the more outright no, is just like gathering more data. Like if it's an outright no, like why? If it's a slow burn, it's like, hey, like what is blocking? Like what are your doubts? Like what needs to happen on my end or on your end to make this a reality, right? I think it also helped that I had this I had a return offer from Google, and I had this other offer from Microsoft, and I communicated very explicitly, like I would much rather be working here with you all, but if that's not in the cards, like let me know sooner rather than later, so that I can sort of activate on one of these other opportunities. So I think that's my first thing, is just like use rejection as an opportunity to gather data, right? And then I think the other thing is also just like, I think that to me, I always tend to interpret rejection as an opportunity to sort of reframe. Like I think another form of rejection that I've experienced throughout my career is like, I told you that like very early on into my time at the Creative Lab, I sort of pitched this new product idea and became a sort of product lead, like a sort of project lead on that, right? And rejection also came later in that process, in the sense that the project just eventually ended up getting tabled. Like it sort of lost momentum, and we decided that we weren't going to pursue it anymore. And I think it's really easy to like, especially when you in a space like the Creative Lab, where it's sort of easy to think of a project that you start as your sort of brainchild. I think it's easy to attach a lot of like, really easy to take rejection of that sort really personally. But I think another thing that I sort of had to sit down and realize was like, part of why this didn't work is because like, oh, like the timing wasn't right for like the company to release something like this, or like, maybe like it was just that the Creative Lab wasn't the right people to take on a project of this nature. And actually these things were like, in follow-up conversations that I had with my manager and other people who were involved in the process, like these were the sorts of things that came up. But again, I wouldn't have even gotten there if I didn't use rejection as an opportunity to gather data, which goes back to my first point, right? But so I guess these go sort of hand in hand, but it's like, I think rejection is an exercise to practice like, like really sitting and critically inquiring as to like, what were the factors at play here? Like sometimes it's you, and sometimes there's like growth or like, a course correction that needs to occur there. And that's valuable learning in and of itself. But sometimes, and I would say most of the time, the picture is larger than that, right? So I think I've always used rejection as an opportunity to step back and try and identify like, what are the elements of the bigger picture that I'm missing?
Interesting. I love that. Rejection is an opportunity to get more data. I really like that. So you're such a confident person. Like so when I say this question, I ask this question, it's like sometimes I wonder like whether people experience this at all, but I think everyone does in some way, like imposter syndrome, right? This idea like, maybe I don't belong here, maybe I don't have the qualifications, maybe they think I've got something that I don't have. Like, what is that experience like for you? And then how do you kind of get past imposter syndrome?
Absolutely. I mean, and I think that there's not a day that it goes by where I don't feel like in some ways I'm like, it's not even so much imposter syndrome as it is more like, whoa, like these people are executing on such a high level, like, and like, what am I doing? You know what I mean? So I think that part of how I've wrangled that is like, one is just sort of identifying, like, I mean, it's the sort of cliche answer. It's like you can't be like, you're here for a reason, right? Like if you weren't fit to be here, you simply would not be here, right? So that's the first thing I think is like my sort of grounding truth is like, well, like whether or not you're supposed to be here or not, like you are. So let's move on, right? And I think the second thing is also just like, for all the people in my career that have made me feel imposter syndrome, I've like gone out of my way to just schedule a one-on-one with them and be like, hi, you're so cool. Like, how can I be as cool as you? Or like, how can I like I've identified XYZ things that I can learn from you. Like, would you agree? Or like, do you have capacity to like guide me in any sort of way, right? Like, I think that I think that if you're feeling imposter syndrome, like that's almost like an indication that like you're just in like an information-rich space that you actually have a lot to get out of, right? So again, like I think my sort of coping mechanism for a lot of these things is just like the sort of reframing exercise is like, okay, like the imposter syndrome is like the negative side of like whatever the objective fact is. Like maybe the objective fact that underlies imposter syndrome is that there are people who are more senior than you, or there are people who are executing at a higher level than you, or there are people who know more about whatever the thing is than you do. So like, that's like maybe the objective truth. The imposter syndrome is like the sort of like visceral, cognitive, psychological reaction to that, right? But I think there's another side of that is like, okay, like, what do I have to benefit from this situation? Like, what do I have to gain from the situation? I feel like when I started sort of just like approaching, like letting my imposter syndrome sort of fuel this hunger to like continually grow and continually build, like with the people that are around me, I think that like a lot of it sort of evaporated. And then I think you also just come into conversations with people, and like for every person that I've been able to be like, oh my gosh, like I think you're so cool because you do this thing like in this way that I've never thought of, they've like reflected it back at me in like this, like, oh, I think you're so cool because you do this thing that I've never heard of, right? So like I think that like the more you just put yourself out there and the more you just talk to people, you realize that like yes, like you have a lot to learn, but also like you have a lot to bring to the table, and that is just evident in the ways that like people interact with you. You know what I mean? Like I think that like I had a moment of like realization in the lab, like especially after this whole TextFX thing, like the number of people I had come up to me and be like, Aaron, like, how did you do this? Like what? Like, how did you? To me, it was just like my job, right? Like to me, it was just like, okay, like I'm tech leading this, like let's get it done, like let's do it. But I think sometimes it's important to like just like take a step back and be like, oh, people, like you're on people's radars, right? Like whether or not you realize it, like if you're there, you're on people's radars. So it's, I don't know. These are just a few of my coping mechanisms.
Yeah. So the I've already learned so much from you. The imposter syndrome, the way you describe it, it's really, really interesting. Just this idea, like it's almost like, like you said, like if you're in the room, you deserve to be there one way or the other. If you are reacting with imposter syndrome, there probably is an objective truth, but you're just having like kind of this emotional experience. There's when we talk about like going back to your creative process, like there are times when you got to just get stuck, right? And you're just like, you've hit a wall. Like when you hit a wall, what do you do? Like,
yeah. Okay, so one of the first things that I do when I hit a wall is just anything else, anything else than the thing that I'm doing. Because I think sometimes it's just an indicator that you need to take a step away. And like, granted, like we don't always have the luxury to like step away from like an urgent task or whatever. And I'm not saying that, you take like a week-long hiatus, but like sometimes it's just like, I just allow myself an hour, 30 minutes to like like hop over to my piano, or like just do something else that where I'm still like activating this very creative, because most of the times when I get stuck, it's like I have to, like, people are looking to me to either identify a problem or create a solution, both of which are very sort of like heady creative tasks, right? And so what I do is like, I have this mantra that I always say is like, you always want to keep the thing spinning. You want to keep it spinning. So it's like, you know, maybe I'm stuck in this one way, but I need, you know, obviously I need to keep my creative momentum going. So I shift to a different creative task, or I, you know, like start thinking about something that I have, like a bucket of like spark idea, like we call it, you know, sparks, like ideas that you sort of, just ideas basically. I always just have like a bucket of sparks that I want to pursue. So sometimes what I'll do as an exercise when I get stuck on a project that is like, you know, maybe P0 that I really need to get done, is like, okay, I'm going to spend 30 minutes just like flushing out one of these sparks that I have. And then sometimes in the process of flushing that out, like you discover, you know, like a paradigm, or you discover a pattern, like, oh, like that's actually like the solution to this other problem that I'm having. You know what I mean?
Totally. And the sparks aren't necessarily like, it's just an idea that, like, maybe it's like an idea in like something with code, could be a musical idea. Like, could the sparks be like different, like in, like it's mainly like you're shifting gears completely after the problem, and like that process of like figuring out like kind of an unrelated problem literally sparks a solution almost. Yeah.
Sometimes I will shift to something that's completely unrelated to like my job. But when I say sparks, like, so at the creative level, we use the term spark to refer to just like a feature idea, like an idea, like a feature or a product idea or something like that. So like my drive folder of sparks is ideas that like potentially I could bring into the creative lab, right? That I just maybe haven't showed to people, or I've only showed to like a designer or something, right? So I mean, that also sorts of like working on this, like shifting my attention to this bucket of sparks that I have, sort of alleviates this like underlying anxiety of like, oh, I'm not being productive, like I'm not doing work. Because who's to say that like this spark that I'm fleshing out isn't like the next money making like next big thing for Google, you know what I mean?
Right.
Like that's kind of my job. It's my job to sort of identify problems and identify solutions to those problems, right? Which I have. I'm in a very privileged position, like that is my job. You know, sometimes you have to find ways to do that within the parameters of your role. But like, I guess my like key takeaway here is that like there's always something else to do, like in work or outside of work, especially in work. There's always something else that needs to be done, right? So sometimes if I hit a wall in something that I'm doing, it's just like an indicator. Okay, like let me shift my attention to something else that I need to do for a little bit, and see if a solution emerges either as a function of solving that other thing, or just, you know, just comes out, just I get a moment of inspiration. Another thing you can do is just turn to the people that you're working with, right? Like, I don't think, especially when you consider that, especially at a place like Google, it's like very seldom, if ever, the case that you're working on something like in complete total isolation, right? It's always a collaborative effort. And so I think that like another thing to do is like when you hit a wall is to just like look to one of your collaborators and be like, hey, like, you know, I would love to get your thoughts on this thing that I'm having difficulty with. Or I think that there's this feeling, I think it's a really like vulnerable thing to admit to people that you're stuck. But I think that it's a skill that everybody needs to develop, because it can only benefit you. You know what I mean? Like, I've never had a situation where I've like gone to a colleague or gone to my manager and said like, hey, I'm feeling a little stuck. And the response I got was like, no, you're not allowed to be stuck. Or the response I got was negative in any sort of way, right? So I think part of it is just, it also goes back to this idea of rejection and vulnerability and feeling like you're not performing, or, you know what I mean? Like I think that's something that I've learned granted, I'm very early in my career, but I think something that I've learned even at this point is that like a lot of the expectations that you have for yourself are so much higher than the expectations that the people around you have. You know what I mean? Like the people around you, like your manager has factored in time for you getting stuck. Your manager has factored in time for like failure. Like these are all parts of the process. Like for better or for worse, like your situation is not so unique that like it's never been seen before. You know what I mean? Like, so sometimes I just have to remind myself like, yeah, like this is something that happens to everybody. And I think that that sort of like grounding, like, you know, at Google right now, there are probably 30,000 other people who feel similarly, like is also a sort of like good, like grounding thought that I have.
One last question. 14-year-old Aaron, you're going to give some advice to 14-year-old Aaron. What advice would you give to 14-year-old Aaron?
Yeah. Okay. I don't mean this to sound like bad. I think I would probably tell 14-year-old Aaron, like, keep on track, like keep doing what you're doing. But the sort of what I mean by that is like what I would say to 14-year-old Aaron is like keep connecting the things. Like I think that like a lot of my success and a lot of like my even my superpower at the lab has been defined by my ability to take things that I'm interested in or things that the world needs and things that Google needs and connect them in ways that people hadn't seen, right? So I would say that I think that like there's no like connection that is too far-fetched. There's like no connection that is too far-fetched or that doesn't like make sense, right? Like I think that a lot of my job has never been like it's never been like, oh, like does this make sense? It's always been like, how do I convince the people around me that this makes sense, right? So that's what I would tell 14-year-old Aaron is like you have the ethos to speak on the things you care about just by virtue of caring about them. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, totally
made up at a certain point. So like, you know, connect the things, gather all the data, use the data to connect the things. Sorry, I speak very generally and at very high levels of abstraction, but because that's how I think. But that's probably what I would tell my 14-year-old self.
Well, I'll probably need to ask this in a different way to you in particular, because you said keep doing what you're doing. So what were you doing at 14?
Oh yeah, sorry. What was I doing at 14? At 14, I was rejecting all of the notions that told me that I had to be a math science person or an English reading writing person. I was rejecting all of those notions of like you have to specialize, like you have to put yourself into this box. I think at 14 what I was doing was like trying to grow along all of these paths, and then along the way like find the magical moments where things fold into each other. And those were the moments where I like going back to connecting the things, like those were the moments that I realized like, oh, this is like the same thing, but in a different font. And even in my job, like even at Google, I feel like there's this pressure, like even when I talk about like, when I tell people I'm a creative technologist, they're like, oh, so are you like a software engineer? Are you like a designer? Are you like a product manager? And my answer to that is usually just yes. So I would just tell my 14-year-old self that like, yes, like you eventually will have to work a job and be in the real world. That doesn't mean that you can't grow in all of the ways that you envision yourself growing in. It just means that you have to be creative about how you do it.
You obviously, you know, at a young age, you gave yourself the freedom to explore all these things are interesting, and eventually they start to converge. You know, and you in particular are the full realization, like what you're currently doing, of all like a bunch of different threads converging that you've been working on for so long. So it's pretty awesome to see where you've landed.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something I tell everybody who sort of asks me a similar question is like, you can do whatever you want. Like, you know, there are like in our lives, there are real constraints and like real search costs. And like, those are things that we have to like wrangle with. But like at the end of the day, like you can do whatever you want. Like maybe it's not to the extent that you want it, or maybe you do it, but it has a different name. You know what I mean? Like you can do whatever you want.
Yeah, you probably didn't know there was a thing called a creative
I
technologist.
had no idea. I had no idea that was a thing.
Yeah, yeah. It's been so fun to talk to you. It's been really fun. I know the people that are watching are going to be super inspired, and you definitely been inspirational to me. So thank you for joining.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been
Awesome.
a pleasure.